Hi everybody, welcome back to our lecture series on the textbook Everything's an Argument. We are going to be talking about chapter 4 today, which is arguments based on facts and reason, or logos, and this is lecture number 2. So if you're paying attention, you notice that we skipped 2 and 3. It's really important that you read those through. They address arguments based on ethos and arguments based on pathos. So it's super important that you read those all the way through. There's just not a lot of detailed content that we can really necessarily need to lecture about. So we're skipping it over and we're going right to chapter 4, which is a really important and interesting chapter that addresses a very complex aspect of argumentation, which is understanding and thinking about arguments that are based on facts, based on reason, appeal to logic, appeal to our logic and our reasoning. So today we're going to be addressing the Myside Bias, what facts are, testimony and narratives or stories, surveys and polls, statistics, thinking critically about information, evaluating evidence, a process of evaluating evidence or using evidence to support your ideas called triangulation, and then of course online information verification. As you can see, it is a lot of information that we're going to be addressing, but the nice thing about having this recording is that you can pause it at any point, continue to take notes, take a break, that type of thing. And I really encourage you to do that just to make sure that you can really focus on everything. So make sure that if you start to feel like you're losing track, getting spacey, getting bored by me, whatever, pause the video, go take 5-10 minutes, take a little break, and then come back to it. Hopefully this video isn't too long, but we'll see. Okay, so we're jumping right into it here. The Myside Bias. It would be useful for you to pause and take a second just to think about what you think this means. But ultimately it comes down to the fact that numbers don't lie, right? But people do. And if you understand how to manipulate numbers, if you understand how to use statistics, how to use data or quantitative research to support or promote your ideas, you can do some things that are a little bit more nefarious than we might want to address. The Myside bias is the strong tendency to accept information that supports our beliefs and values and to reject information that opposes them, as well as to our tendency to think we know a whole lot more than we actually do. And you can get this quote directly from page 59 of the book. But the idea here, the whole idea behind the Myside bias is that we have a strong tendency to accept information that supports our side and a strong tendency to reject information that opposes that. We want to be aware of that because that makes us uniquely susceptible to being manipulated, being persuaded by information that maybe isn't great. So we really want to be aware of that. Anytime you're reading something and you're like, yes, that should be a red flag. Take a second, pause, and think about this. In the field of behavioral economics, there's this idea, and also in psychology, this idea that our brain seems to function in two different ways. And simply we can think about it as our fast brain and our slow brain. Our fast brain is like really what's going on. It's our responses. It's our glandular reactions. It's the things that we do on the fly without really thinking about them. It involves a lot of our feelings, our values. Those immediate responses really come down to our fast brain. But our slow brain is more reflective, more contemplative. We think about things in a more detailed manner and get deeper into those ideas. So what we want to know and what we want to do with relation to Myside bias is avoid those fast glandular reactions and get more reflective, get deeper into our ideas and to think about the information that we are addressing. A really simple activity that you can do by just pausing the video is to take 3 minutes to think about and describe one time where you were affected by Myside bias. If we were in class, we would share, but for you, just think about it. Maybe take some notes, really process it, or maybe go ask a friend or a family member or significant other if they're around. And you might be surprised at how recent the last time you were a victim of the Myside bias, because it happens pretty often, or it can happen pretty often. Okay, So we know about Myside bias. We know about our tendency to think that we know a lot more, to reject information that we don't like, and to immediately accept information that supports our side. And this gets us directly into the idea of logos, or logic and reasoning, arguments based on facts. We throw that word facts or fact around a lot in our public discourse just day to day. I know I personally do, and I hear people do it all the time. But ultimately, we don't ever really define what a fact is, and it might be a little bit more complicated than we typically think. So my question for you is, what is a fact? Pause the video here, write down what a fact is. If it takes you a few minutes, that's fine. No hurry, but it'll be very, very useful for you to come up with your own definition of what a fact is before we continue to move on. Now, once you have defined a fact for yourself, you can take a look at a dictionary definition. And we'll talk about some of the problems with dictionary definitions later on in the class, but for today this will be fine. And we want to think about definitions in a variety of ways, and particularly when it comes to facts. Now we're going to change the screen share here for just a second because I want to share with you the definition from Merriam-Webster online. So our definition of what a fact is, according to Merriam-Webster, is something that truly exists or happens, something that has actual existence, or a true piece of information. That's the essential meaning. We get into the full definition of something that has actual existence and actual occurrence. So there's a lot of room for interpretation there. But quite simply, it's something that exists. It's something that is real. Now, we can say, yeah, that applies to almost anything. You can compare it to your definition. But what we want to do is we want to start to think about knowledge in a more complex manner than that. We want to think about knowledge in kind of three different categories. So we have a fact. This is like an objective truth. This is something that is true 90+% of the time, depending on your room for error, that is going to happen when you control for the same variables over and over and over and over and over again. This is something that we do in science, and it's typically produced and supported and found in lab settings or in highly controlled environments. Our day-to-day life is not a highly controlled environment. So when we're thinking about a fact, we want to think about probably more like their convictions. And convictions are reasoned or supported opinions. These are things we can say, this is true, and here is why this is true. Here are my reasons to support. Here's my evidence. And that can be your personal experience. It can be a variety of different things, and we'll evaluate those things differently and in a more complex manner later in the class when we really dive into that. But we want to think about facts as being objective truths that are true regardless of how we feel about them, regardless of what we call them. We want to think about convictions as being reasoned or supported opinions. And we want to think about opinions as being those feelings, beliefs, values, those glandular reactions that occur from our fast brain, and sometimes maybe we can't explain why we feel that way. Why do I like crunchy peanut butter better than creamy peanut butter? I don't know. I just like it better. That's an opinion. So what we want to do is really start to think about facts in a more complex way. We want to define it. We want to think about, instead of facts and truths, we want to think about convictions, reasoned opinions, reasoned beliefs. So what we want to do is, with this question, is think, should we broadly trust facts? And the answer to that is probably yes, right? If it's an objective truth and it was developed in a way that we can get behind, that is supported, that is sound, then yes, we want to trust those facts. But on a day-to-day basis, when we're just having a conversation with somebody at work, between classes, whatever, when they say, oh, that's a fact, or it's a fact this, we should probably question that and think about it more as a conviction. So when it comes to facts, we often think about that information being very strong or stronger than other types of information. But that can be tricky, because if we get away from thinking about things as facts and start thinking about them as reasoned opinions, that really opens the door to the different types of evidence that we can use to support how we feel or why we feel the way that we do. This is really, really important because that gives us a lot of room for interpretation, and therefore gives us a lot of flexibility when it comes to the arguments that we're making. One very effective use of evidence or type of evidence is testimony. And testimony and narratives are used throughout our lives, and predominantly you can think about like eyewitness testimony in the judicial system. But eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, but yet it carries a very heavy weight. It's a very powerful means of getting somebody to agree with you, because stories have been the way that we have been sharing information. And when I say we, I mean human beings. The way that we have been sharing information for hundreds, thousands of years. Prior to the modern age and the development of the printing press, the development of written language, which is also a technology, the only way that ideas were shared was through speaking, was through the oral tradition, was through sharing stories about where food was, where water was, where you should stay away from because there's predators, where you should go because there's game for hunter-gatherer societies. There were so many different uses of stories, and up until fairly recently, historically at least, that was the primary means by which we shared information. Now we have a different means of doing that, but testimonies and narratives still carry a lot of weight with us. So we want to think about stories as being evidence, as being primary sources, as being secondary sources, as being valuable. And you don't want to just simply dismiss them, because they can be excellent tools for appealing to your audience in different ways and for making very, very strong arguments. Now, stories are often used to support stances throughout our society. Right? We've got personal arguments, we've got law, we've got politics. Politics is a huge one where we hear stories about how people come to their values, their beliefs, all sorts of things. But again, testimony is notoriously unreliable, so we want to have some question marks. We want to think about personal stories as being potentially inaccurate or subjective. We have to engage our slow brain, engage our critical thinking processes. We want to think about stories and how we tell them, how we are affected by the language in which we tell them with. And that's a really, really important factor, because the language that we speak has a direct impact on the way that we perceive the world, the way that we interact with reality. We'll get into this a little bit more later on, but I have a quick question for you. And that's quite simply, should we broadly trust narrative and testimony? I asked you a similar question about facts. We had a little bit more definitive answer there, saying, yeah, probably. But what about narrative and testimony? I'll leave you to answer this question for yourself. The next type of evidence that we're going to talk about, or when we're talking about arguments based on facts, is going to be surveys and polls. And this is going to be more quantitative data. It's going to be more information using numbers. But we want to define what a survey is and think about them. We can think about them synonymously. So surveys and polls are widely used to efficiently get an idea of what we think people are thinking and feeling, but they're not perfect. If you were paying attention to the 2016 election or alive during that time, you likely know that this can be really problematic. So we want to keep in mind there are different ways to analyze this information. We can think about who paid for it, who's publishing the outcome, who was surveyed. This is a really, really important one. Where, in what proportions? Might the demographics impact the involvement and therefore your conclusions or the conclusions you can draw from that information? The answer is yes. All of these things can impact the conclusions that can be drawn from the information that we gather in surveys and polls. When we think about what stakes are involved, so you have something like a presidential election, it can be pretty challenging to get an idea of what the populace is thinking, because people can change on a day-to-day basis. They can change the way they're thinking or feeling about a politician or about a thing or a team on a day-to-day basis. So we want to be very, very critical of surveys and polls. That doesn't mean that we should dismiss them, but we want to think about them in a more detailed manner. We've got some supplemental reading that I posted to Canvas. If you're watching this not during a class time, you don't have access to Canvas, you can just look up political polls in the 2016 election, and I'm sure you'll find the article about it. But it simply addresses some of the errors with the polling data with the survey data that came out of the 2016 presidential elections. So now I have another question for you. Should we broadly trust surveys and polls? Again, challenging answer. It's up to you to decide that. But hopefully by the end of this lecture, maybe we won't be able to answer all the questions, but we'll be on the right path to figuring out whether or not we should even answer those questions. Okay, now we're really getting into it here. We're getting into the statistics. We're getting into numbers. We're getting into that quantitative data that we often think about as being the best information that we have available, because really, really smart people are crunching the numbers and doing all these things. And we like to think about that, numbers don't lie. But again, they do. If you remember, numbers don't lie, but people do. And people interpret numbers. And numbers rarely speak for themselves. Actually, numbers never speak for themselves. They don't speak. They have to be interpreted, right? That information has to be interpreted and shared and created by people, by human beings. Now, hopefully you're thinking, I could see why that might be a problem, because humans are fallible. We have a term called, or a concept called, human error. So humans are fallible. So if we're interpreting numbers, that means that there's room for error that's inherently involved simply because humans are involved. Okay, well, maybe we shouldn't trust numbers as much as we think. I don't know. To be determined. If humans are so prone to error and emotional and are filled with personal biases and agendas, what should we trust? Statistics gives us a good reason for trusting that information. There's lots of different ways to analyze information, but it shouldn't be a one-stop shop for trusting a source, for gaining some credibility or determining whether or not you can trust your source for your paper, for your debate, for your presentation, for your next speech. So I have another question for you. If we think about human beings and the issues that we have from all these different perspectives, from emotions to biases to beliefs, and we have to interpret the information and share that information and discuss and deconstruct that information, that quantitative data, those statistics, should we broadly trust statistics? Again, challenging question. I don't know. I don't know if there's generally an answer to that. But what we want to do is we want to get comfortable evaluating information. We want to think about how we can determine if, particularly statistics, if a statistical finding matters. We want to think critically about the information, all the different types of information that we've addressed, from stories to facts to definitions to statistics. We want to think critically about them. But we have to have a particular way to do that. We have to have some tools in our toolbox in order to think critically about those different types of information. So how do we determine if a statistical finding matters? There's two critical questions to ask. Number one, is the finding statistically significant? Ultimately, this means, does the finding generally relate to the broader population of interest? Yes or no. If it's statistically significant, we have one question answered. If it's not, we still have that question answered. It gives us a tool. It gives us some way to structure the way we can think about statistics. And then we want to think about, is the effect large? Simply, should we care? Now, this information is coming from an article in Psychology Today. You have the link down at the bottom, and also the link is going to be on Canvas. If you don't have access to Canvas, you can see the web address right here. We're going to get into some more of this information from this article because it was really, really useful, and it gives us some simple ways to analyze statistics on a day-to-day basis. So, number one, is the finding statistically significant? Number two, is the effect large? So we've got three ways to lie with statistics. You might be thinking, well, why do we care how we can lie with statistics if we're trying to determine if they're credible, if they're trustworthy, if they're valuable? Well, if you know how to lie with something, you are hopefully aware of how to detect that lie. We want to be aware of that particular thing. So one thing we want to look at is how people will amplify the importance of statistical significance. Gerer says, as you can see by the above reasoning, statistical significance is limited in its importance. While statistical significance can tell you that some finding is likely to represent how things are in terms of patterns at the broader population level, based on how statistical significance is determined, you can in fact never be fully certain that you are correct. That's really, really important. You can never be fully certain that you are correct. So therefore, we are not dealing with facts when we're dealing with statistics, right? Because facts are objective truths that are repeatable, that are testable. If we're dealing with statistics and we have a professional here saying that you can never be fully certain that you are correct, we're not dealing with facts, right? That changes things if we start thinking about statistics in that way, where maybe we can't trust them fully or outright. Maybe we need to think about statistics in with the same level of uncertainty that we think about stories. Just some food for thought there. The author goes on to say, so amplifying the importance of statistical significance without providing sufficient detail about the process by which statistical significance was determined is one way that a researcher might, even if unwittingly, accidentally, misrepresent things with statistics. In short, just because a finding is statistically significant does not make it true, does not make it a fact. So again, we answer that question, is it statistically significant? Yes or no. That still doesn't give us a really simple way to answer the question about whether or not we should trust statistics. But what about number two? What about the second way to lie? We can capitalize on type 1 error. If you haven't taken statistics, fear not, we're going to get a little explanation here. Gerer says, without getting too bogged down in the details, type 1 error exists when a researcher finds that one result is statistically significant, but in fact, the reality is that the findings do not generalize to the broader population of interest. This kind of outcome is actually more common than one might think. It often results from a scenario in which a researcher conducted a plethora of significance tests as part of the analytical process. In short, the more significance tests someone conducts during the analytical stage, the more likely he or she is to find a spurious result, a problematic or inaccurate result. That simply means a result erroneously comes out as statistically significant. So take a second here and think about this. The more testing we do of the measure, the more significance testing we do, the more likely we are to generate error. So the more tests create more room for error, which actually reduces the amount of credibility we can have in that particular test or in that measure. If you conduct 1,000 significance tests, you are likely to find a few of them as significant simply by chance alone, because that's how chance works. Sometimes a researcher might, again, unwittingly or accidentally, present a statistically significant finding as a big deal, even if it is, in fact, simply spurious or accidental, and the result of the researcher conducting too many analytical tests. Okay, so we know two different ways in which we can lie. One is going to be on accident, one could potentially be on purpose. But what we know here is that the more tests that are run, the more likely we are to find a result that we want, that aligns with what we think is going to happen. Therefore, the numbers can lie. By simply doing it, right, we increase the room for error. We increase the chances of creating type 1 error. And our third way to lie with statistics has to do with reporting effect size information. Now, sometimes, for various reasons connected with the hypothesis testing process, a finding might come out as statistically significant, but it might correspond to a small and perhaps irrelevant effect. When presenting statistical findings, then, it is important to present information on both statistical significance and effect size. So that's why we ask those two questions at the beginning of this little activity. And the effect size. If a finding is statistically significant and the effect size is relatively large, that is when you can really start to feel confident that the effect being discussed is actually meaningful and worth talking about. When a researcher emits information on effect size when presenting statistics, he or she may be over-amplifying the importance of the result. Now, this is a really, really important aspect to think about, because if we can purposefully amplify or increase the perceived importance of a result, That's a very simple way to make it seem like what we're talking about is important, when in reality it's not, or at least our data doesn't support that. So we want to be aware of a couple of different ways that we can purposefully or accidentally lie using statistics. That's really important because we can say the numbers don't lie, but what we've seen between these three examples here is that they actually might. If it's not human error, if you're just running more tests to see, all of a sudden you create the chance that something might seem important when it's actually not. So what we want to do, again, is think critically about information. We want to evaluate things, and we want to really deeply understand that, especially when it comes to hard data, to quantitative research, statistics never formally prove anything. They're not facts, right? We want to think about them as being as problematic, as challenging to deal with as individual or personal testimony. Now, that might be really, really hard to wrap our mind around, because we, in our day-to-day life as academics, we often put so much weight on data, on information, on those quantitative numbers, and then we use that to support our stances, but that doesn't actually prove anything, which is why when we use that information, we are making an argument based on fact, based on logos, based on logic and reason. We are not necessarily creating facts, right? So just be aware of that. Okay, so what is critical thinking? I've said that a couple of times in this lecture, and it's actually very, very difficult to define. So I'll give you a couple of different options here from two very different timelines. Number one, critical thinking is active, persistent, careful consideration of a belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and the further conclusions to which it ends. Number two, making reasoned judgments. You can align with either one of these, or you can write your own definition, whichever works for you. I typically go with the simpler one, and we want to make reasoned judgments. We want to think about our convictions, our reasoned ideas. So we're going to go through a couple of different terms or different concepts that we can use to test evidence. So number one, we have accessibility. And this is just simply thinking about how easy it is to access and or edit the information that we're accessing. Is it behind a paywall? So say like a peer-reviewed academic journal. So it's kind of difficult to find. It's difficult to access unless you pay for it, unless you have access to a database that has paid for it, right? But then we also want to think about that on the other side. What if it's too easy to get to and anybody can edit it and access it, like say Wikipedia? I don't know. We have to use these terms to think about things critically and to analyze them. There's no one-stop shop for analyzing information. So it's really, really important that we understand that the more terms, the more concepts, the more vocabulary, words that we have in our toolbox to analyze information, that's going to help us make those reasoned judgments. Number two is credibility, or simply trustworthiness. What are the author's credentials? Do you consider the source credible? Why or why not? Have some reasons. You want to think about it. We want to engage our slow brain, our reflective brain, our analytical brain, as opposed to just saying, yes, this aligns with what I think or what I know to be true, and engaging in that Myside bias. We want to think about consistency. Does the source use the same language throughout, or do terms change? This is called linguistic consistency, and it will hopefully give you some insight into how confident that person feels about what they're talking about, or how sure they are of themselves. We also want to think about the tone. Does it change? And then in a larger sense, consistency can relate to the broader field of knowledge that that relates to your topic. So if everybody that studies this thing accepts a couple of things to be true, or says, all of this information aligns and this is accurate, if you have somebody who comes in and says, actually it doesn't align, this is all wrong, and you have an entire field, an entire database, an entire way of thinking about the world that is wrong, that requires a lot of evidence to support it. And typically we want to think about those inconsistent ideas as being a little bit more problematic and warranting a lot more detailed thinking, a lot more detailed analysis. Next, we have recency. So this has to do with time. When was the thing published? Was it published? When was it last edited? This is information that directly relates to how we think about things. For example, when I was in graduate school, I wrote a paper on genetic engineering, and I used a source from the late 1960s, early 1970s. And I used that to show that I had done my research, that I understood how the conversation on gene editing started. And my professor in the class asked me, why am I using that source? And I said, well, I'm showing that I understand the context of the overall conversation. Now, that's not always going to work because the technology, the understanding we have of genetic engineering, of the human genome, of DNA, has drastically increased over the last 60 or so years. So what I needed to do was use more recent information to support my ideas, which I did. So we want to think about recency. We want to think about how that information that we're using that may be a little bit dated, how does it translate to a modern context? We want to think about relevance. And this is simply asking if the source is addressing our topic directly. For example, if you are writing a speech for a public speaking class and your topic is climate change and all of your sources are talking about global warming, you might be unsettled to know that you probably need to do better research because the two topics are actually quite different. Global warming addresses the overall increase in temperature around the entire globe, and climate change addresses the changes in climate at different areas or on different parts of the globe. And it can be more regional or it can be a little bit more broad. You can look at entire areas or hemispheres. So it varies. So one thing really focuses, the other is still focused, but it's focused on a different thing. So we want to think about relevance. Are we talking about the same ideas? Is the author talking about the same thing? We want to look at documentation. Does the author state their sources? Do they have any sources? Are they primary or secondary sources? Are the sources based mostly on statistics, on testimony? Are they saying that using a lot of facts? They're using a lot of terminology that may boost the perceived credibility of what they're saying, but actually there's a lot of problematic ideas layered in there. We want to look at the documents and we want to think about the sources and where they're coming from. This is really, really challenging, and I'm going to give you some tools for evaluating online information here in just a few minutes. And then we want to think about intended audience. So every time we write an argument, every time an argument is proposed, it is proposed with a particular audience in mind. So if we're thinking about arguments and the title of our textbook is Everything's an Argument, we're going to think about maybe a television commercial being an argument. That the goal of the producers of that commercial is to get you to do something. Typically it's to buy something. So exchange money for a good or a service, right? So they're proposing an argument to you. It's called a proposal argument about what you need to do and why you should. So we want to think about the intended audience because those arguments are going to change based on the audience. If we are using information that is from a book that maybe we bought at Barnes & Noble and it's written for a popular audience, that's going to have different terminology, different language. It's going to be written differently than if you are using a book that is for a group of professionals or experts on a topic. So we want to think about how the intended audience can impact how we evaluate evidence. So we've got 7 different terms here that can give us some insight into how and why we can evaluate evidence from different perspectives. It helps us to make more reasoned judgments, more reasonable judgments, stronger analysis overall. Now, crop detection or triangulation is a really, really simple, real-world, day-to-day way to support and think about ideas. It was developed by Howard Rheingold, and the overall concept is that we find 3 separate, credible online sources that corroborate the point you want to make. Pretty simple, right? So any stance you have, you find 3 outside sources that are independent of each other and that are consistent. They align with each other and support your stance. It's easier said than done, honestly, but our ideas, our arguments are only as good as our sources, only as good as our evidence, only as good as our reasons. So it's really, really important that we're thinking critically about all of the information that we're coming across. Now, at this point, if you're watching this online, you want to pause the video and look at the links, or you can simply look up these videos by Mike Caulfield. There are 4 of them, and they give us some really, really excellent online verification tools, different ways to do what's called lateral reading, and to gain a really, really complex understanding of how we can use the technology and the mass amount of information at our fingertips to actually help boost our ability to trust or to not trust, to get away from evidence that's problematic. There are 4 videos. If we're in class, we'll watch them right now. If you are watching this online, pause this video, watch them, and then come back. Okay, welcome back. I know we've addressed a lot. This is a pretty long lecture, but quite simply, what we're trying to do is we're trying to gain a more detailed understanding of how we can evaluate information, how we can evaluate and understand arguments based on facts. That requires that we understand the different types of evidence that are going to be used and have some different tools or some means to analyze that information. In this lecture, we went over the Myside Bias, which is our tendency to agree with information that supports our stances already, to reject information that it goes against us, and to think that we're more knowledgeable about things than we actually are. We talked about facts and how we can interpret them and the different definitions. We talked about narratives, stories, surveys and polls, statistics, and how easy it is to make mistakes or to lie with statistics, whether on purpose or not. We talked about how we can think critically about information through different evidence evaluation techniques and concepts. We talked about triangulation, and then we watched some of those 4 amazing videos by Mike Caulfield on online information verification. I hope that you feel a little bit less confident about the information that you're coming across and are more comfortable reminding yourself to take a step back, to engage our slow brain, to use some of the concepts, some of the ideas that we addressed today, and to analyze information, and then hopefully you'll start sharing and interacting with information, with better information in a more critical manner. Take care, everybody.